Shalom Chavrim, I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You're watching Israeli News Live, and today we have a very special guest, Christopher Bollyn. And, I always like to surprise you guys, never like to really tell you who's coming on in advance, but I am sure it's going to be a blessing to you. And, of course, joined here besides Christopher, we have on a live audio feed out of Sweden, and, of course, my wife, Yana Ben-Nun. And so God bless all of you that are watching. Christopher, thank you for joining us here today. We're so glad to have you here on Israeli News Live to talk about terrorism on a global scale and how that is affecting the world in different regions.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, and I would like to introduce Christopher for those who don't know who he is. He's independent investigative journalist. He also has a degree in history, specializing in Middle East, Israel and Palestine. And he is the guy who is the author of book Solving 9/11 and who was able to show us how Israel is connected to 9/11. So Christopher, I'm also very happy to have you here. But first, I would like to clear a few things up, because if you Google Christopher Bollyn, name Christopher Bollyn, you will find out that they actually smeared him, ADL smeared him, and he has put on him a label of anti-Semite. So, Christopher, I would like to ask you this question, if you don't mind. Are you anti-Semite?
No, I'm not anti-Semite. I grew up in the Episcopalian Church in America, so I was raised with a lot of biblical stories and gospel stories growing up. And after I finished high school, I went to the Middle East, and I wound up in Israel when I was the winter after I turned 18, and I spent several years in Israel altogether. Most of the time working on a very Zionist kibbutz, which was, of course, a Jewish enterprise, a Zionist enterprise. And I actually had a Jewish girlfriend who I married for a couple years when we traveled in the United States. And so I don't have any hostility, any sort of irrational hatred or dislike for Jewish people at all. I think that the Jewish people have been misled, as the Christian people have been misled, and other people have been misled.
Yes.
But in the case with Israel, they've been woefully misled into, by false prophets, into a Zionist nightmare. And when you point out that the failings of this Zionist enterprise, when you point out the criminality, the terrorism that it has inflicted on the Jewish people and the world as a whole, the protectors of Israel, like the ADL, will invariably throw out the anti-Semite card.
Right.
And it's what they do. It's their strongest and their immediate defense.
That's right.
So I'm used to it, and but I'm not an anti-Semite.
Right. Yes. Well, you're talking here to Jews. So we know that you're not anti-Semite, and we are not self-hating Jews. We are after the truth and after factual information. Steve and I are doing a lot of investigative work ourselves, journalistic investigative work into many issues. And what impresses us is if someone has documented evidence. And what got me about you as I listened to videos, you mentioned that the towers, 9/11 towers, came down by nanotechnology. And when I heard that, I knew that Israel is a powerhouse when it comes to nanotechnology. It all originated with them. And I am also investigating 5G technology, and I found out that it was Israel who made agreements with India and China about 5G, which is potentially extremely dangerous weapon against the people. So when I heard you speaking about nanotechnology connected to towers, that was a major red flag for me. But as far as understanding, Israel must have been involved. And if you Google yourself or research how Israel is a number one powerhouse when it comes to nanotechnology. You will see yourself what I mean. So when you say, I want to go there first, when you say it came down by nanotechnology, who did you consult that could prove it? You consulted?
Well, yeah, it was in 2005. I was working on. There was some very strange things about the 9/11 catastrophe that were sticking out. One was, for example, the high amount of molten metal that was found at the bottom of all three towers that fell that day, and also tiny metal droplets that were found in the dust. The tiny metal iron droplets that were found in the dust of the World Trade Center are called signature characteristic, meaning that if it's dust from the World Trade Center, it's going to have these little tiny droplets, about 10%. And I met with Stephen Jones out in Utah because he was interested in the evidence of thermite. Mm-hmm. And he asked me if I could get samples of the dust. I was on the way to California at the time. And out in California, I found a survey of the dust done by the United States Geological Survey, which is a collection of papers. And it was a very rare book. There were only 2 copies in existence in the whole state of California. And one of them happened to be at the University of California at Davis in the science library. So I photocopied the book and it had photographs of these little tiny droplets of molten iron, which I thought was very interesting. I brought the paper back to Professor Jones in Provo, and he eventually was able to get something like six samples of the dust. And in the dust, he found these tiny chips they're called bilayered thermetic material. One side was kind of orangish, the other side was silverish, and they're 2 sides of the same material. May have been a foil, who knows? But in any case, he tested this material. He thought it was paint at first, but when they heated it up to 430 degrees Celsius, the material detonated and created a great deal of heat and a tiny metal droplet, a tiny droplet of iron and a little bit of aluminum. Exactly that's what we find in the dust. So this is proof of an explosive nanothermetic material that was found in the dust of the World Trade Center in all samples that he tested. There were 5 samples that he tested. Wow. So there we have it. We have the smoking gun. That it was at least one of the materials used. There were probably other explosives that were used that day, but this was certainly one of them. And when you're talking about nanotechnology, what it does is it creates a thermetic reaction, but the surface area of the reactants is so great that the reaction is very fast and very powerful, and it becomes fast enough to become a detonation, which is faster than the speed of sound. So you have an explosive material. Right. And there we have it. So we had the smoking gun. When this was discovered and published in 2009, it was basically the end of the official version as the explanation for what happened to the World Trade Center.
Right. Wow.
The following year, Judy Wood came out with her book about the demolition of the World Trade Center, in which she claims that it was a cold event. Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, it was a very, very hot event.
Right. So why do you think Judy Wood came up with that? Because there is a lot of other stories about 9/11, other than formal story that the bunch of young students, Arabs, brought the towers down. We already, I hope majority of people know this is not true anymore, but there is a lot of other theories. And why do you think that is? Because the problem with it is that there is a lot of other theories which creates confusion,
Right.
But
That's the whole reason.
Exactly.
The purpose of these, I call them red herrings. It's an old hunting term, but it's they create these. In 2010, 1 year later after the discovery of nanothermite was proven and published in a peer-reviewed paper, Judy Wood comes out with this book and claims that it was a cold event, that it was done with some sort of direct energy weapon, that I think she used the word dustified the buildings.
Yeah.
And she kind of poo-poos the evidence and claims that this is what happened. And her book was published and pushed a great deal by the powers that be.
Right.
And it was meant to be a red herring, to take people off the track of the nanothermite evidence into this Buck Rogers type space weapon, or there was another guy talking about nuclear bombs were buried deep underneath the World Trade Center, and they somehow did it. These are competing theories that are brought out in order to confuse the public. And by confusing the public, you make the public, the individual, tired, becomes apathetic, comes to a point where it says, I don't really care anymore, it's too confusing for me, and they give up.
Right.
And that's exactly what the goal is.
So basically, it's infiltration of the 9/11 truth movement by
Well,
controlled
it's been
opposition.
infiltrated from day one. It's been infiltrated from the very beginning. So, yes, it's infiltration.
Let me just make this statement here, because this is something, guys, that if you you pay attention to anything that goes on when you're dealing with truthful facts, like in our research on Zionism and how that during the Holocaust, how that they worked with the Nazis to create the State of Israel, the transfer agreement, things of that nature there. One thing that I have found consistent in the Zionist creation of the State of Israel, which I am not against the people of Israel going to the homeland, but let's don't do it with violence. Let's don't do it with driving out everybody in the land, because we're not dealing with giants. But the point is all these different people that we have saw in online and the evidence about certain individuals, they talk about how great they were, especially in the case of the early leaders of Israel, Ben-Gurion, Moshe Sharit, etc. But when you find out the true facts from those that were witnesses, the rabbis and things that have written documented evidence, and those that are secular Jews wrote documented evidence, it's always just the opposite. And so it's the same thing with the terroristic activities, especially in 9/11, which is the catalyst for driving the United States into the war, quote unquote, on terror. They're going to throw out all kinds of different diversion tactics to confuse the people and to keep the people from really knowing what really actually happened.
Maybe divide and conquer, that's their way. But anyway, we have found online many stories about how Israel was involved and evidence, and I found out that you, Christopher, is the originator of all of that, but nobody gives you really credit that it was you know. So I want to ask you, please tell us more about all the evidence that you have, and you can take your own pace and start wherever you want. What is the actual evidence, documented evidence, that Israel is connected to the 9/11?
I'm glad you put it that way. About the connections, the connections of Israel to 9/11. Well, it all started, on day one. I happened to be passing through New York City with my family early in the morning. We couldn't go to Washington because of the attack at the Pentagon, so we headed back for Chicago through the Pennsylvania, and there were reports very early on, September 11th, I think about noon. Ted Koppel came on AP radio and said that the FBI was looking for 5 Middle Eastern men who had been seen photographing and celebrating the attack on the World Trade Center. And I turned to my wife and I said they could be Israeli. And lo and behold, the next day I found out from the author of the article in New Jersey, his name is Paulo Lima, that indeed they were. These were what we now call the 5 dancing Israelis. 2 of whom were Mossad agents known to U.S. law enforcement, 3 of whom were operatives. They were all working for this company called Urban Movie Systems in Weehawken, New Jersey, who, according to Forward magazine, Forward newspaper, turned out a few months later to have been a Mossad front, tied into the whole 9/11 complot, conspiracy. Well, from the very beginning, you can see I saw that there was this connection, and then there was the instant messages. That this is another problem. Odigo instant messages. That an Israeli company that had instant messaging service on all various platforms, like your Blueberry or your internet or your email or what have you, your telephone.
Right.
And that this message went out a warning message went out several hours before 9/11, warning apparently in Hebrew language not to go to the World Trade Center because there would be some disaster happening there, and that the vice president of the company in Israel, his name is Alex Diamandis, he told the Israeli paper that the warning was precise to the minute, and meaning 8:45 in the morning. So these 2 stories came out very, very early, and I was in touch with the Israeli embassy at that time because there were many dozens of Israelis who were arrested in connection with 9/11, and so it was obvious that the Israelis were tied in at one level, that they had prior knowledge, that they had expected it, that these 5 dancing Israelis were seen photographing across the river from the World Trade Center before the first plane struck.
Right.
That's important. That's important to understand. So they knew what they were expecting. So, I used it then as a hypothesis, as a possibility that Israel had some connection to this. Either people used to talk in the old days of let it happen on purpose or made it happen on purpose. Well, in some way they knew about it. And I wanted to know what was the connection. So I continued doing my research, and this went on for years. My book, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, was only published 11 years later in 2012. And it's based on all the articles that I had written, which is why there's a companion volume called Solving 9/11, the original articles, which has all the articles in chronological order that show where I come to this conclusion. And it got to the point that the consistency of Israeli involvement was 100%. So that if I found then a loose object, a loose person, a person who was clearly involved in the 9/11 cover-up, and I didn't know more about this person, by digging, I would find out that, lo and behold, he is connected to the Zionist involvement. And when we're talking about a Zionist involvement, we're not talking about people who are just like connected to Israel, giving charity or money or support to the state of Israel. We're talking about people who are tied into the Netanyahu government at a very high level.
Right.
So then, with all of this evidence and these books solving 9/11, then I said, well, of course, why did they do it? And the why is the most important thing. 9/11 was done because it kicked into operation a long-standing Israeli plan known as the War on Terror.
You know what, Christopher,
which was rolled out by Netanyahu in 1979.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll stop you right here because we will come back to that War on Terror. But these 5 dancing Israelis, didn't they come on later in Israel to their own TV show and admit it?
They were on Yair Lapid's show. Yair Lapid, the finance minister,
right,
who became finance minister, the son of Tommy Lapid.
Mm-hmm.
And Yair Lapid was interviewing them, and Mr. Elner, Oded Elner, was the one who told Yair Lapid. He said, "Well, we come from a country that experiences terrorism on a daily basis."
Right.
He says, "Our purpose was to document the event."
Wow.
Now he said this in Hebrew.
So there was admission,
But this leads to the first question that Yair Lapid should have asked. Is like, well, of course, who sent you there? But of course, they didn't go there.
Right.
But yeah, he admitted in plain Hebrew. And these men had been held in the lockup in Brooklyn for 2 months, I think it was. Mm-hmm. They were held from 9/11. They were held until like November or before Christmas, and then they went back to Israel on visa violations. And there were scores of Israelis who were arrested in similar relationship to 9/11, who all were sent back to Israel on visa violations.
Mm-hmm. Right, and then also when you say that Israelis were warned, didn't Israeli newspaper Haaretz also admitted that?
Yes.
Yeah, Haaretz is the newspaper that reported about the Odigo instant messages, mm-hmm. and yeah, that came up in Haaretz, absolutely.
Yeah, that's important, because as you say that long before they even admitted it, you already suspected it, and then
let me just say this real quick here too, though. What we're doing is we've been able to capture a lot of the images that you've shared in some of your conferences. So I have on the screen for the people to be able to see the Haaretz article about Odigo to begin with. And of course they downplay it on Haaretz. They only say, I think, like 2 people that actually got the warning. But we know that there were 4,000, according to the very news reports, 4,000 Israelis that were near the Twin Towers when they fell, and were of course missing at the time. But what's interesting though is Haaretz kind of dodges the truth of fact that more people got the warning. In fact, there was one I noticed one time before you had mentioned about, or I saw an article there where it was being played about one particular American politician, and I can't remember if he was in politics in New York or what it was, but he actually admitted that he had gotten the warning, a friend of his got the warning and then told him, don't go to the World Trade Centers today.
That was Al Franken. Al Franken.
Yes.
Right. So these are like real proofs. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, yeah, Al Franken wrote that he got the warning. He called it the Jew call. He called it in his book, "Liars, Liars, and Damn Liars," something to that effect. And he said, to tell you the truth, I got the Jew call. He said he got it from Mayor Koch, the former mayor of New York, and told him not to go to the World Trade Center in the Hebrew calendar on that day. His office didn't want to write back or didn't want to answer, any more questions about that, but that's understandable. Yeah, there's other people. There's a lot of people that got the warning. I mean, the former mayor of Oakland, California, got the warning. Other people, many people got the warning. They knew not to fly commercial or whatnot. So it was like an open secret.
Now the thing is too, they of course they blamed it on the Saudis, and you did some really good work on this as well. That the so-called Saudis were never the ones used on the plane. They'd only stole the identity of these people here. So my question is, was the planes actually just remotely flown into the buildings, and were there actually no people on there?
That's a very good question. You there's a lot of questions there. The first thing is that in the very beginning, these so-called hijackers' names were not on the passenger list. And so I called United Airlines and American Airlines. This is back in September of 2001, and I think it was American Airlines told me, well, we didn't put their names on the passenger list because in order to put a name on the passenger list, we have to get the okay of the relatives, which was a bogus answer. So that she's implying that all of these hijackers were not reachable, their families were not reachable, yet all the other ones were. No, there was some tomfoolery going on there. These guys were not on the planes. Then the lists were doctored after the fact, and their names appeared on the list, right? Something like that. But yeah, and there's also this very important evidence that the plane that flew into the South Tower and the North Tower, both of them, just before they struck, there was a flash of a bright white flash. And it's barely visible on the North Tower, but on the South Tower it's very clear. And there's a piece of video that shows that an object has been fired from beneath the plane, and it goes into the tower, and it's white hot, and it makes a white hot hole into which the fuselage of the plane enters. And then it comes out the far side of the building, this white hot burning object, which is probably a depleted uranium warhead burning about 6,000 degrees Celsius. And it was like the spark that went into the tower, and both planes went into computer rooms, by the way. The South Tower computer room was heavily laden with thermite material that had been placed there probably summer before in these big black boxes. So what we're talking about weaponized drones. We're not talking about Flight 175 and Flight 11. We're talking about planes that are made to look like those planes that, as you said, probably did not contain human beings, at least not living human beings, and were basically drone aircraft that were being flown remotely that were weaponized. So, to answer your question.
Before we go to why it happened, do you have any more evidence that you can speak of?
Oh, there's a lot. The Southern 9/11 books each one is 360 pages, and they're chock full. But what happened is that as I wanted to wrap the book up in 2011, I focused on the cover-up and the destruction of evidence. And like I said, there again, I found that the people involved in the cover-up in New York City and the people involved in the destruction of the evidence and the junkyards that received the metal were all tied to Israel at a high level. And so it became, even Mark Rich was involved in this and people like that. So it was very clear that the operation from A to Z had an Israeli connection at every crucial point.
So,
the question becomes, if like the judge, Alvin K. Hellerstein. Alvin K. Hellerstein was the judge who oversaw the entire 9/11 tort litigation, all the process. 96 families who held out for a day in court to find out who was responsible for the loss of their loved ones. The litigation was, of course, ICTS, the Israeli company based in Holland, International Consultants on Targeted Security, which does airport security and passenger screening at Boston, at Newark, at Dulles, what have you. But in the Boston situation, they were in the defendant's seat, and they would have to explain. They would have to produce evidence that these guys got on the plane, how they got on the plane, why they let them on the plane, all that kind of questions. But none of these cases ever went to trial. Every single case was settled out of court, and this was all by pressure by the judge and his Zionist assistant, Sheila Birnbaum, who shut down every single family, so that all of the families that were involved in 9/11, there are 3,000 families about, and not a single one of them ever got a day in court. This is unbelievable. Mm-hmm. I know people in Europe who couldn't believe it when I told them this, and they made bets that I was wrong or I was right, and I was right, of course.
Right.
I was right.
How about the evidence of liquidation of the materials?
Yeah. This is the destruction of the evidence of the World Trade Center. From the very beginning, there was an emphasis on destroying the evidence. It was not treated as a crime scene. Now, the crime of 9/11 was given to the Assistant Attorney General at the time, a man named Michael Chertoff. Michael Chertoff happens to be an Israeli national, Israeli citizen. His mother was a Mossad agent, Elizabeth Eisen. He grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and he was the assistant to John Ashcroft. Because Mr. Chertoff was in charge of the criminal division of the FBI, of the Department of Justice, he was given the file, the 9/11 investigation file. And so he is the person at the top who oversaw the non-investigation of 9/11 and who allowed the destruction of the evidence. Then they turned the evidence over to the Department of Design and Construction in New York City, and went from one Zionist hand to another Zionist hand until it went all the way to China on boats through Zionist-owned junkyards in Jersey to be destroyed. So it was the purpose, and you have to understand that this was being done at a time when the price of scrap steel was the lowest it had been in 50 years, which meant that in just the transportation of the steel, all of the profit was being removed, was being lost. So the question is, well, why didn't they just keep the steel in America and maybe sell it to closer foundries like in Pennsylvania or Ohio? Right. Why go to all the trouble to send it to China at the expense of $25 a ton shipping? Well, because the purpose was to destroy it far away from the prying eyes of Americans who were looking, because the steel was full of evidence that the buildings had been destroyed using these kinds of technologies I was talking about before, like nanotechnology, thermite, what have you. The columns were severed. There were pieces of steel that were vaporized. Mm-hmm. Vaporized. That means that the steel had reached the boiling point of iron or steel. The boiling point.
Right.
One thing, Christopher, let me and I'd like for you to comment on this as far as those that are not Israelis that were involved in this conspiracy. And I'll just say it this way, because I've been speaking in private meetings, but I have yet to bring this out publicly because we're working on filing an affidavit with federal courts there. But when I did work with the intelligence community years ago, I watched many international cases that have never been solved, and the money laundering, and of course the politicians that were involved that I am aware of, their records are being subpoenaed. And then I watched an elaborate cover-up. I've seen many people that were silenced that knew knowledge, and then it went all the way to the top in 1990 with George H.W. Bush putting a stop to the investigation against certain companies that were involved in the alleged money laundering schemes that I've been speaking about here recently in private meetings. Now, with that in mind, and I can go back even to the Kennedy assassination from information I knew about that as well, and it's still the same game today. Even in the current administration, there's still money laundering going on. There's still arms being supplied to the terrorists around the world to continue these operations. So I realize, and it can't just be the Israelis, because we know that George Bush was in the presidency at the time of 9/11, so there had to have been some definite involvement with current political figures in the government. What kind of knowledge do you have on this type of information in the cover-up?
Well, let's start at the top. as you mentioned, George Herbert Walker, or George Bush, and Dick Cheney, and John Ashcroft, people like that at the very top of the Bush administration, they are complicit in a war of aggression because they took the United States to war in Afghanistan and Iraq based on false premises, which they did not investigate, in which they fabricated evidence, in which they knowingly conspired to wage a war of aggression. Now, this is what the highest level people from the Third Reich were hanged for in Nuremberg.
Right.
This was American law. The United States of America wrote the law. So if it means anything, it should be applied to our officials as well as former German officials.
Right. So let's go
That's it right there. Because if George Bush, this is the worst kind of atrocity, worst terror atrocity that ever hit the United States. The President of the United States and the Vice President are obliged to carry out an extensive blue ribbon investigation. Having failed to do that, and having taken the nation to war instead, the war we're still in, by the way, the war on terror, they are complicit in the supreme war crime. And you have to take the people, and charge them with crimes that you can charge them with, that you can prove, that you can show. There's no question. The Chilcot inquiry that was done in Britain clearly lays out that the war in Iraq, if not the war in Afghanistan, was a war of aggression. Tony Blair is complicit as well. So if our Western democracies mean anything, they mean that we should hold these people, these leaders, accountable for crimes of, huge crimes, supreme war crimes.
So Christopher, now is the time to go into why it happened. Why did 9/11 happen? Why did they do that? And then, as you speak about that, go to Oded Yinon plan. So you can kind of bring history of all of this. And then, of course, how is the Likud party involved?
Sure. Well, of course, the Likud party came to power. Well, they were founded in 1973 by Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, and Ariel Sharon. Basically, this is the Troika. In 1977, Menachem Begin became prime minister. That's the year. I lived in Israel at that time. That's when the terrorists came to power in Israel. The former heads of the Irgun and the Lehi or the Stern Gang, what have you. And they promptly began putting into operation the invasion of Lebanon in '78. And what they were trying to do, they were trying to put into effect the Oded Yinon plan. The Yinon plan was written in 1982, but it basically calls for Israel to become the predominant hegemon in the area by breaking up the Arab states, particularly the secular Arab states, on the Eastern Front. Number 1 and number 2 were Iraq and Syria, and breaking them up into ethnic statelets. This is a process that's sometimes called Balkanization, or Bernard Lewis called it Lebanization, breaking the country up into its ethnic constituent parts along religious lines or ethnic lines. And that's what we've been doing in Iraq, and we've been working with in Syria as well, and other countries. Libya is now in that situation, Sudan, Yemen. There's numerous countries that have been broken up along these lines. This is the Israeli plan to dominate the region. And they got this in 1979. Menachem Begin put on a conference called the International Conference the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism at the Netanyahu Institute, where the hosts were Benjamin Netanyahu and his father Ben Zion. And this is when they rolled out this idea of a war on terror to take the place of human rights. So terrorism became the new emphasis. And it's interesting to note, this was in 1979, that all the terrorism was blamed on the Soviet Union. Very much like today, you see that the Russia can't do anything right. Russia is constantly being vilified.
Right.
For what reason? It makes no sense. But in any case, they rolled out this in a propaganda offensive in Jerusalem at this conference, and Netanyahu began writing books about this, basically taking the speeches that were given, putting them together in book form, and releasing it. The first one was in 1981, International Terrorism, Challenge and Response, Netanyahu editor, then Terrorism, How the West Can Win, Fighting Terrorism, what have you. And what he was doing in the 1980s, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel today, he was kept on reiterating this need for the United States and the Western allies to come into the Middle East to wage war against those terrorist entities that were afflicting Israel and the states that harbored them. Well, they couldn't get this. This is like they were trying to light a forest fire that was wet. They were trying to light a bonfire that was wet. They couldn't get it to light. They tried and tried and tried. There was a lot of smoke, no fire. Then 9/11 happened, and it was all over. That was it. The war kicked into high gear. You had Bibi Netanyahu telling the New York Times it was good. You had Ehud Barak, his commander in the site at Matkal, in the London studio of the BBC World and in Sky Studios as well, on 9/11, before or shortly after the towers fell, giving the Israeli military intelligence explanation, interpretation of what we just witnessed. So this is called the primal effect. When you have a tremendous catastrophe like this, people are stunned and they don't know what to think. And the primacy effect is to get that explanation to them, a plausible explanation to them when they are in that state. Because the terrorism has affected them in such a way that the first person who comes in with a plausible explanation of what happened, they will accept and they will disregard things that come in afterwards. And that's what they did. And so this is Bibi Netanyahu and Ehud Barak who pushed this very much, and this became, of course, the war on terror.
Right. So basically, Israeli criminals are using United States and United States people and young boys and girls, United States military, to fight their wars that were pre-planned, like in Oded Yinon plan, that they wanted to expand Israel to greater Eretz Israel, through certain borders.
Well, it's not Israeli criminals. When we call them criminals, you kind of like put them in the category of like being mafia. It's Israeli military intelligence we're talking about.
Okay.
And Lieutenant General Raphael Eitan, this is the one that was Lieutenant General, the Chief of Staff, Raphael Eitan. He's passed away now. He said when he was interviewed by the Jerusalem Post about Israel's involvement in Colombia with the drug trade, he said, someday perhaps, if it's decided that the stories can be told, you'll see that the state of Israel has been involved in acts which are 1,000 times more dirty than anything going on in Colombia. But these things were decided by the government in cabinet meetings. As long as the government decides to do something that the national interest demanded, then it is legitimate. But if an individual wants to do the same thing, it isn't. That's just the way it is. It's very simple. And a few years after he said that, he was found dead in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Ashdod. But he was speaking openly about the kinds of things that the state of Israel is involved in. And that's why Zionist history is not taught in American universities, because if it were taught, it would mean, that the real history of Israel and Zionism would come out. People would be talking about it. They would understand that Israel has functioned as a terrorist state for a long, long, long time, since before it became a state. There's a book out now, it came out this year, called Rise and Kill First by Ronen Bergman, New York Times bestseller, in which Ronen Bergman, an Israeli, reveals that Israel was involved in trucks and car bombings in Lebanon between 1979 and 1983, in which they blew up whole neighborhoods with these truck bombs and car bombs that they perfected. Well, of course, 1983 was the same year that the U.S. Marines were blown up at the barracks in Beirut, killing something like 271 Marines. And this was all being done by a nebulous group called the Front for the Liberation of Lebanon from Foreigners. But it was an Israeli operation run by the man I just quoted. It was run by Raphael Eitan. So it's like, here we have it. It comes out years later, that what the Palestinians have been saying was completely true. That all these huge car bombs and truck bombs that went off in Lebanon for 4 years were being done by the Israeli military themselves.
This is shocking. Can you please repeat the name of the book slowly and the author?
Sure. It's called Rise and Kill First.
Okay.
And it's written by Ronen, R-O-N-E-N. Last name is Bergman, like Ingrid Bergman, Ronen Bergman. And it came out in January 2018. And what's interesting is that he reveals this in the book, but whenever he's interviewed by the American media, like New York Times, they kind of avoid asking questions about this operation. Clearly, because they don't want American Jews to understand some of the dirty business that Israel's been involved in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. I can understand that.
Can you talk about General Clark and how he predicted, these Middle Eastern wars? Mm-hmm.
Wesley Connor Clark. Actually, he's part Jewish. I think it was his mother or his father was Jewish. His father was Jewish. And he was running for president. And in 2007, he explained, this is 6 years later. But he talked about going to the Pentagon shortly after 9/11 and being told about a memo that was in circulation at the highest level of the Pentagon that called for, this is just after 9/11, called for the United States to overthrow 7 countries in the Middle East in 5 years. And they started with Iraq and Syria and ended with Iran. And he explains that this was a classified memo, but it called for putting into effect this Unknown plan that we were talking about earlier, basically breaking up the secular regimes of Iraq and Syria, for example, and Gaddafi and Libya, and breaking these countries up and replacing them with, failed governments. Like today, Libya is a failed government. All these countries are failed now. So what we're seeing is this memo being put into effect. It took them a little longer. It took them more than 5 years. They've been working on it now for 17 years. But it's come at great expense to the United States and extreme great expense to people in the Middle East. And, I live here in Sweden, and, you talk about Semites. Half of my neighbors are Semites. They're not Jewish, perhaps. They're Assyrians and Syrian people and people from the Middle East. But they're people who've been displaced by the wars.
Right.
Because Sweden happens to be the country that has received the most of these migrants, refugees per capita.
Yeah, so United States is not benefiting out of these wars at all.
No, Trump said back in April, he said, we spent $7 trillion. That's trillion with a capital T. He said in 17 years. And what have we got for it? Nothing. Well, this is just one of those times he was speaking off the cuff. But that's exactly true. We've spent, that money will have been spent when you count interest and accrued interest and the veterans care in the future, it will be well over $7 trillion. And we've got nothing for it. Rather, it's been extremely detrimental. Mm-hmm. That's where I come from. I'm an American. I care about what happens to my country and to this country that has been the hope of the Western world for a long time. And I see it being taken down into the gutter. Yes. We're being plundered. Our prestige and it's being destroyed. And this is all part of a plot.
Yeah, now you spoke about Trump, that he said that. However, he surrounded himself with men called Bolton, who is
Pompeo, all the warmongers, and yet he talks about making America great again.
What changed? I mean, he said that the Middle Eastern wars don't benefit the United States, but then when he's in office, he continues the same agenda.
Well, isn't he known as being a showman? He's a bit of a showman here. We're seeing this kind of schauspiel, this appearances and reality not quite being the same. I mean, it's like this is what we would have to expect with a person like Donald Trump, who's known to be quite narcissistic and also to be a showman. And we've known from day one that he's extremely close to the Zionists, the hard right-wing Zionists in Israel. He's very close to obviously Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is very close to his son-in-law Jared Kushner, and the Kushner family has a criminal background. It's a whole nasty group of people. Friedman, his ambassador to Israel, is a very hard-line Zionist as well. So America has dropped all pretense under Trump of being an even, fair partner in looking for Middle Eastern peace. But of course, all that even-handed, fair partner stuff hasn't brought us anywhere closer to Middle Eastern peace in 50 years. So maybe this is now Trump is pushing the envelope very, very far. He's depriving the Palestinians of any sort of benefits from America. At the same time, he's doing all the things that the Israelis want, and he's promoting a war agenda with Iran. It's absolutely frightful. I can understand why half the people in the U.S. military are afraid of a big war happening very soon. Well, because everything that Trump is doing is aggressive.
Yes, and Christopher, one thing that I've noticed with President Trump, I mean, he didn't change anything from what was happening under President Barack Hussein Obama. It's still the same scenario, and of course, I suppose making America great again is the military-industrial complex to keep people employed through making bombs, etc. And, I was trying to be optimistic when President Trump became president because he was talking about, lifting the sanctions on Russia, pulling our troops out of Syria. And but that was all just for smoke and mirrors, make everybody feel great. And of course, then he got the evangelical community rallied around him, which that was another, to me, a smoke and mirrors there. But that was also to help bring about the support for Israel. And of course, Israel, with the, it's a big mystery about the two-state solution they were going to do. And then one of the latest things that came out was, okay, Israel would do a two-state solution, but Gaza would be left out of it. Everything seems to be all based around more war, more proving grounds for your weapons to be able to try it out. So the more terror we can put in the world, besides the fact that they want to totally take out all these nations so that they can broaden the borders of the state of Israel, completely and totally contrary to what Moses would have ever said to do. And of course, we're not dealing with giants anymore, so we have no reason to go and kill your neighbors when half of them are probably descendants of Jewish race to begin with, or Israeli, I should say. But the thing is I keep seeing that same thing over and over again. Gaza's going to be left out. Why? Because you got to have a place to test weapons, so you can't let that become part of the two-state solution. You got to continue the war in Syria in order to make sure that we overthrow Syria, because after all, one friend that I have there in Israel who's got a lot of family in the intelligence community has said to me, he said, look, Steve, he says, I'm watching them as they lay the pipes out. He said, I saw how that China got the contract to be able to dredge out Haifa's port to make it bigger. He said, we're going to get the pipelines through here. And he said, one way or the other, it doesn't matter. He said, Russia's fighting to keep Assad in power so that Russia can control the gas and pipelines. He said, and the United States and Israel are working together to overthrow Syria's government in order so that they get the pipelines that come through there. And so it just never seems to end. Everything seems to be about money at the cost of innocent lives, which is on a detrimental scale. And that's not even bringing in the issue of Yemen and the catastrophe that we have there.
Yeah, well, the Syrian war is a disaster, of course, and they have created something like half the population has been displaced. There's, of course, the pipeline. There's always these pipelines that are being planned or built, and competition, for the pipelines. But what we're seeing now is, of course, we're seeing this unraveling of the Saudi regime. With this murder of the guy in Istanbul, what appears to have been a murder of Khashoggi, and so the question is, what will happen? The Anon plan calls for also the dismantling of Saudi Arabia, by the way. So this may be the beginning of the end for the Saudi regime.
Right.
But the pipelines, in my mind, are secondary to the overall plot, which is to control the entire Middle East. Because when you control the Middle East, as Israel aspires to do, then the pipelines will come in as you like. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Right.
Control comes first. Control comes first. And so this plan, when we talk about Israel, it's very important to understand that we're not just talking about Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Knesset. We're also talking about entities like the Rothschild family, the big financiers who were instrumental in the creation of the State of Israel. They're a very active and very powerful force to be reckoned with. And as we see when these wars occur, the Rothschilds are involved in strategic investments in oil or minerals. Even in the case of Yugoslavia, they get something out of it. So it's you have to understand that Israel is a unique country in that it's a small country with a very big hinterland, and the hinterland of Tel Aviv goes all the way to London and New York City.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back a little bit, just kind of back up again, and I know that Bibi Netanyahu wrote a book where he predicted kind of 9/11 event, and then Mike Evans, wasn't he told in 1970s that the towers are going to be struck?
Right. You have a good memory.
Can
Yes.
you
Of
talk
course.
about that, please?
Michael Evans was interviewed, or he interviewed Issa Harel in the 1979 time frame, 1979-1980. This is when you have a picture of Michael Evans with Mr. Menachem Begin as Prime Minister. So you can see he's at a very high level. He's not just a guy, an American Zionist visiting Israel. He has dinner with the Issa Harel, who was the founding chief of both Mossad and Shin Bet. Mm-hmm. So it's like this Issa Harel is a very, very high-level pioneer in Israeli intelligence. And he told Mr. Evans that night that Arabs would attack the tallest building in New York City. And he explains this. He laid out a 9/11 scenario, predicting it. In 1979, he said that they would attack New York City. They would attack the tallest buildings in New York City because these are symbols of your fertility. And what's interesting is that Michael Evans, retold these stories to the Jerusalem Post, and he had a website called the Jerusalem Prayer Team, mm-hmm. and these were his revelations, or his discussion, his revelation about these stories came out after 9/11. So it was like he wasn't hiding it. It's not hidden, but this is the kind of thing, when you understand. And also we have a Israeli filmmaker called Arnon Milchan, who made a film depicting exactly what 9/11 was a year before it happened. It was called The Lone Gunman, in which a passenger aircraft is hijacked remotely and flown into the World Trade Center.
Wow. And
his first film that he made was in 1978. He was an Israeli. He's a very high-level intelligence agent. He's one of the guys involved in smuggling plutonium and nuclear components for nuclear bombs to Israel under the Lakam. Well, this guy, Arnon Milchan, he made Pretty Woman. He made Fight Club. He made all kinds of JFK. But he made a film called The Medusa Touch, his first film, in which the climactic scene is Richard Burton using telekinesis and flying a passenger aircraft into not the World Trade Center, but in a Pan Am building in New York City. Mm-hmm. So this man has been fascinated with this, making movies about planes flying into high-rise towers for 23 years before it happened, 20 years before it happened. How prescient.
This is amazing because, like everything you described, they had this perfect plan, this pre-existing knowledge of every aspect of it.
Well, they actually planned for it to happen much earlier. They actually wanted it to happen in the 1980s, before the internet, of course. But they were thwarted. They had a guy named Avram Shalom Ben Dor and Zvi Malkin, and these are two of Issa Harel's highest level agents. And they came to America, as retired pensioners from Mossad, so to speak. They never really retired, but they came to the United States and they tried to get the terrorist contract for the World Trade Center, the anti-terror security contract for the World Trade Center, and they actually got it in 1987. But when it was discovered by the Port Authority that Abraham Shalom Ben Dor was using a fake name and he was guilty of serious crimes in Israel, they tore up the contract. But had that contract gone through, then the World Trade Center attacks probably would have happened in the late 1980s. Mm-hmm.
Wow, amazing. Can you also...
But because they were thwarted, they didn't quit. They just went and they got the same position through an American Jew, Jules Kroll, and then they got into the World Trade Center that way. But it took time.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, can you encourage people, especially evangelical mm-hmm. Christians and Christians, to look mm-hmm. into this, because they are in the Zionist churches, like when you see Mike Evans prophesying mm-hmm. over Benjamin Netanyahu that he's going to be a prime minister, he looks like a prophet who knows up front what's going to happen, he has some kind of special anointing, and these people are deceived by this, not knowing that he's just an agent who has pre-existing knowledge of what's going to happen. So what can we do, Christopher, we need a criminal investigation into 9/11. Are you doing anything about making this happen? Like, do you have anything out there that we can...
Yeah. Well, the thing is that my research is all out there in these books, Solving 9/11 set of books. And my latest book about the war on terror is out there as well. And this material is being taken by people who are trying to make this into an investigation, in New York City, there's the Lawyers for Justice, for 9/11 Justice. It's a rather new group, but they have sent the paperwork to the attorney, the district attorney, or the attorney for the South District of New York, and he is therefore obliged to either panel a grand jury or to refuse the request. Mm-hmm. And that's the closest we have to citizens' action bringing forth some results. But you have to understand that there's huge political pressure not to do something like this. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens with this appeal for a grand jury in New York City. But that's what we have to have. But because the evidence is out there, and what we now need is, actually, as you say, a proper criminal investigation, because people don't understand that 9/11 was never investigated as a crime. It was treated as a war, an act of war. And the very first day, USA Today said 86% of the population thinks it's an act of war. So George Bush said it's an act of war. We're going to war. We're going to go, and they created something called the Authorization to Use Military Force, which gave the president the authority to wage war anywhere he wanted to in relation to 9/11. And that's what they've been doing for the last 17 years, and it's turned into the largest and most expensive and costliest war in U.S. history. And so it's all based on fraud, the whole thing. So it's a giant house of cards that come falling down. The sooner the better.
Well, the same thing was recently in Israel. The Israeli government passed the Knesset passed a new bill that give the Israeli Prime Minister and of course the Defense Minister broader powers to be able to wage war as well. So they're really covering all this up under these pretenses here, and of course they're dumbing the public down and believing that hey, this is for your protection. And one thing I could say, Christopher, is that what you have tried to put forward as a citizen, one thing people could probably do that are listening is also put pressure on representatives that you do know, that you have contact with, that hey, that this has been put forward, as a inquiry to try to get an appeal for a criminal investigation on 9/11. Put pressure. Let people know that has been submitted. Put pressure. This is what it takes. It takes journalists working together to get the public informed, and then the public is what has to really step up and say, look, we demand an investigation because our American lives are being lost in the Middle East for wars that should not even be going on at all right now. It'd be one thing.
Not only American lives. Just lives of people in this Middle Eastern area.
The people they're the greatest sufferers of this, are the people there, because they're being lied to. We're being told.
And the Israelis too. The Israelis are in a very, very bad predicament because. You have almost like a Bar Kokhba type leadership in Israel today, a zealot, who is taking Israel in a very, very dangerous path.
Blood guilty,
and it's going to cause a lot of suffering for the Israeli people as well.
Right.
Exactly.
And all the people in the Middle East. It's not just Americans. It's all these people. And already 1 million lives have been lost. It's really time. It's really time for people to wake up and to go back to this idea that peace can prevail. But in order for peace to prevail, it's going to require actions by good people.
I want people to understand that by going and investigating this, you are not going against Israel. You are not an anti-Semite. What are you doing with this? You are helping the Jewish people. You are helping them to wake up and understand that their leadership is taking them in a blood-guilty way, and they're going to be punished for this. This is going to blow up one day, because I don't think that's going to be tolerated any longer than what it was tolerated.
You're right.
And to tell us, Christopher, what will happen if we don't wake up? How is it going to all end?
Well, it's like you said. You said it very well. That if we allow this monstrous lie to go on, it will continue, and it'll go to greater and greater wars and greater depth and magnitude. And they're of course planning to do aggression against Iran, which is a very formidable country in the Middle East. And as you can read from the description, there's a lot of pressure to involve Russia.
Right.
And, so the whole thing is, we currently have a setup in Syria and the Middle East, with all these players, very much like they talk about in Armageddon type thing, an Armageddon type situation where you have, Russian planes being shot down with Israelis involved, and Americans right here, and French over here, and everybody's there. Mm-hmm. And one wrong move could cause, a conflagration to just, erupt.
Right.
So we need to have calmer minds. We need to have some truth. We need to understand, and it's as you said, it's Israel has been misled. The Netanyahus and the Likud have not been good for Israel.
No.
And they've taken Israel into a very, very dangerous position.
Yes.
And if Israel wants to really live in the region at peace, it's going to have to change its ways. It's going to have to drop its supremacism attitude, and it's going to have to return to something like one man, one vote, in which Palestinians and Christians and Muslims and Jews are treated as equal citizens in the same state.
That is exactly right. Yes.
That's the only solution that I can see as an American.
Yes.
I mean, America is a country with many different ethnicities and religions. Well, we have one man, one vote. That seems to work for us.
Well, let me give you an example here, Christopher, and for the listeners as well. There is many righteous Israelis. Well, actually many. I mean, there are a lot of them, but there are few in comparison to the ones that are brainwashed by Zionist education. But like, for example, we have Miko Piled. I don't know if you know him, Christopher, but
sure.
He's a son of a general. Yes. Miko Piled, or that's, how would you say?
Michael in English.
Miko Piled. Yes, and he said, in one of his interviews, he said that he was brought up to understand that Palestinians are his enemy, and he was very willing to go and fight that enemy in a state of Israel, right? And then he says, and then he came to United States, and his best friends are Palestinians. So why in United States, where we, seemingly so far we can have equality, freedom, and all of us have equal rights and responsibilities, why can Jew and a Palestinian be good friends? And then once they're relocated to Israel, they suddenly become enemies. So
well, it's like you said, it's this apartheid-like system in Israel, which has been around for 50 years, in which Jews are treated with one code of law, and non-Jews are treated differently, and it's a disaster.
Right, it is, and now with this new national law.
And the thing is, Christopher, the whole thing is, even for religious Jews, this was never what Moses taught. I mean, you might get it in the Talmud, but this is not the principles of a Karaite Jew. This is not the principles that we were ever taught to begin with. We were not to oppress. I mean, it was a clear command not to oppress your neighbor, because we were oppressed in Egypt, all right? And we came out of the Holocaust, and many Holocaust survivors and their family members have spoke about this, that what is happening to the Palestinians today is the exact same thing that were happening to our people. But then again, what a lot of Holocaust survivors don't realize is that the Zionists that were making all these secret deals with the Nazis are the ones that got in power. And in one place, in the case of Kastner was considered by one SS general, I think it was Heinrich Himmler. He said that, or as Eichmann one, I forget which one, he said that he made a better SS Nazi than most Nazis would. But these are the type people and their families that have become in the power of the Israeli government today. And this is what's leading our people in a direction that's in the wrong way. Whereas, the Jews that came from the Holocaust know that we didn't want the same thing happening to others as it happened to our families in the Holocaust. So take the principle of Moses. Do not oppress because you were oppressed. So we've got to stop the oppression. We've got to treat our neighbor as ourselves. And in the case of Syria, this is the matriarchs of Israel. All the matriarchs are from Syria. These are your cousins, for God's sake.
Yeah, and for Christians who support Zionist regimes, they also need to understand Syria is like a bedrock of Christianity. That's where it all began.
Yeah,
and a lot of Christians are suffering. Our own in faith are suffering in Middle East, and Palestinians, many Palestinian Christians, they live under oppression and under apartheid laws.
As well as
it's because you have to understand that this this war on terror is actually a war of terror. So what
Yes.
the United States and Saudi Arabia and Israel have done is that they have created the boogeyman, they've created the terrorist entity that they then excuse themselves to wage war against or around. And they move it around like a moving target, and they destroy places like Raqqa and Mosul and Aleppo or what have you. The Yarmouk Palestinian camp near Damascus, where there were 120,000 Palestinian refugees living there a few years ago. Today there are 200 families, 200 people. And so it's like, this devastation, the destruction that we're seeing in Syria is like what you saw in the Old Testament. It's like what you read about in the Old Testament, where, one stone is not left standing on top of another stone. It's awful, and it's biblical, as you say. So, we have to, as people, we have to move our hearts and move our minds to understanding what's happening and to ending this war.
Right.
What's most amazing to me is why I wrote the book, The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East, is because for 17 years this war has been taking the food off the tables in America, been putting American people under great pressure, sending people off to war. For what? The American people don't even know what they're fighting for. And what's most incredible, having grown up in the 1960s in America, there is no anti-war movement to speak of. How can that be? What's happened? Well, when you understand how propaganda works, it's worked very well in America.
Right. Christopher, did you have some, tell me about your success on waking up people. Are you getting letters that they're becoming awake to this? And does it work what you do? Because we truly passionately want to wake up Christian and Jewish community to these truths that we are speaking here. Do you have good success?
Yeah, it is working thanks to shows, thanks to people like you and people who make videos and make radio shows and whatnot. It has reached many more people are aware that we've been lied to. We've been lied to about 9/11. We've been lied to about the war on terror. We're living in a time of great deception.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
As you said, false prophets and great deception. That is what's going on today. And it's a very uncomfortable place because people don't know what to believe anymore.
Right.
They go on the internet, they get 5 different stories to explain one thing. They just don't know what to believe. And they're very uncomfortable. So it's like now, this awareness, the awareness that we've been deceived about 9/11 has grown immensely. But it takes a great act of strength to address this and to embrace it, because it means basically, for an American at least, understanding that your government has lied to you and that your media have lied to you, and they've done it for 17 years, and there's no change whether Republican or Democrat comes to power, and the war goes on.
That's
so
right.
there's this war party, the secret state war party, what they call the shadow state or the deep state, that pushes the war agenda through, regardless of who's in power, Republican or Democrat. And Americans are fed up with it because it has really reduced the quality of life for people in the United States, obviously.
You know, when Pollard was in prison in the United States, Israeli spy, Netanyahu went to see him, and it was recorded that he said to him that we're going to squeeze United States out of everything, and once we are done with them, we're going to throw them away. And this is what I want to kind of, in closing, I want to encourage Christians and Jews in America and everywhere, whoever is listening, in Australia, Canada, and everywhere, to look into this, do your own research. Get the book by Christopher Bollyn and really look into documented evidence, into factual information, and then spread the word. Talk to your friends, your neighbors, your relatives, so we can all, as a humanity, we can get together and put stop to this monster that is right now riding this beast,
Yes.
So,
and let me just say as well, guys, remember, as Christopher was talking about a moment ago, that we're looking at biblical proportions right now in the Middle East of just totally decimating everything. In your King James Bible, you might read that it's giants. In the Hebrew Bible, we call it Nephilim in the book of Numbers. We have no Nephilim. We don't have, Syrians are not the giants. They're not 15, 16, 17 foot tall. So what are we doing this for? I mean, if Isaiah 17, clearly in the 10th verse, when it talks about the destruction of Damascus in the beginning, He says that Israel has forgotten the God of your salvation, and this is why the demise of Damascus comes about, is because we have forgotten the God of our salvation. And we're not mindful of the rock, which identifies the Christian believer, because you believe that Yeshua is the rock of your salvation. So we've got to wake up, guys. We really do. And Christopher, I want to thank you for being willing to come on our program. We have a tough time getting people on because Israeli News Live, everybody's afraid, whoa, I get on there, they're going to rake me over the coals. But we have one desire, and that's to tell the truth. We don't have propaganda. We've made some changes as time has gone on because we realize that our people are being duped into believing lies, and we're trying to get people to wake up. And that's why we're majorly attacked over this. But we want to thank you for taking the time to come on with us today, Christopher.
Well, thank you. As they would say in Israel, toda rabah v'shalom lachem.
Yeah, toda rabah. Thank you, Christopher.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you guys for watching. Christopher, can you tell people how the best way they could order your books?
Sure. All three books, there's a set of books, the Solomon 9/11 set of books, The Deception That Changed the World, and the original articles are available with the War on Terror book. So all three books together by PayPal or through my website, bollyn.com. That's BOLLYN.com for a $50 donation. You get all three books, mail, shipping and handling included anywhere in the United States. If you live in Canada or Europe, I ask for $10 or $15 more to cover the shipping because it's a little bit more expensive to ship there, to Australia, what have you. But this is the deal. It's basically $50 for the three books through Bollyn.com or by PayPal to Bollyn@bollynbooks.com.
Yeah, and
thank you very much.
I just want to thank you. I just want to add that it's really important you get the books because we only touched maybe 1/3 of information. So
probably not even that much.
Not even that much. So if you really want all the documented evidence, proofs, then you really do need to invest in that. So
that's right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
There's so much there. I did research in these books. There's 11 years of research is in there. So there's a lot of material, a lot of information there. And you need to read the material in order so you can make notes and highlight names and whatnot and make sense of the whole thing. But when you read the original articles, I started writing in 2001, September, all the way through 2012, you can see how the whole thesis developed.
Right.
So it's really essential to read the material. You're right.
You see, to us it was gifted. Somebody on one of our conferences just gifted us your book. So I was.
Oh, how nice! How nice!
Yes, it was
very
very
nice. You have very good friends.
Yes, so very nice. Thank you, Christopher.
You do great work. It's been a pleasure being with you. You do really good work. Thank you very much.
If you can if you can hang on for 1 second, Christopher, we're going to end the broadcast. Thank you for watching, guys. We need to